There are new bombshell claims today from royal insiders who say King Charles's cancer is incurable and he will likely die with the disease.
3 minutes ago, the heavy oak doors of the private Windsor wing shuddered open, and the silence of the monarchy broke forever. There are new bombshell claims today from royal insiders who say King Charles's cancer is incurable and he will likely die with the disease. The news only lasted less than a minute, but it changed what would happen to the royal family's future. Inside the palace walls, Princess Catherine heard the words that everyone was scared of and nobody wanted to say. King Charles's doctors had given very bad news. His health had gotten much worse. His medicine was not working like it should, and they stopped all his important royal jobs right away. Catherine could not stop her tears as Princess Anne stood beneath the chandelier and confirmed the tragic reality that the sovereign's time had suddenly run short. Before we talk more about what this means for the royal family, please subscribe so you don't miss any updates. Hi viewers, have you ever had to keep a devastating secret from your own children just to protect their fragile world? And how long could you pretend everything was fine while your heart broke inside? William stood next to the closed door and watched his wife try to breathe normally, taking her to a private room at Windsor, away from helpers, to escape the crushing weight of the corridor. Windsor was one of the family's oldest homes, used for personal life and official work, but tonight it felt like a cold stone cage.
All right, here we go. We're following some breaking news from Great Britain on the health of King Charles.
So we are learning that the king, during a recent hospital visit for a benign procedure, for when he was under surgery for his prostate cancer, they found another form of cancer that he has now started regular treatments for.
The news about Catherine was both personal and about the government, forcing her to read the medical paper and read the last part 2 times, while the words remained careful, yet painfully hard. Buckingham Palace whispered through the silence that Charles was much sicker, his medicine had failed entirely, and doctors ordered him to stop all public and government jobs that a king must execute to keep the nation running. She put down the paper and whispered that Charles promised to stay strong, to help them with what comes next. But William moved toward her, only to watch the princess cover her face before he could say a single word. She broke down completely, her fear growing parallel to his, while he forced himself to stay frozen in calm authority, because she needed a husband, and the country needed a future king. The quiet got deeper when William told what the public had not heard, revealing that in a recorded meeting with doctors, the king's close family was told to get ready for sudden changes that nobody could predict. Charles was still awake behind those mahogany panels, but nobody knew how fast things might change, turning ordinary fear into a paralyzing terror. William then told a second terrifying detail that the public did not know, explaining that in a private record made by the king's secretary, Charles asked to see his son and Catherine one at a time before the sun went down. This request sounded unmistakably like an end, carrying a gravity that reached far beyond mere medical treatment into the dark unknown of succession. Catherine wiped her face with a trembling hand and asked if Camilla knew, causing William to stop for a chilling moment. The Queen had learned Charles was sicker, but she did not know what Charles actually wanted to talk about in those private meetings, leaving a dangerous gap of missing information that hung like a threat in the air. Catherine's tears were just the first sign of massive institutional problems, because behind all this medical news was a family facing giant jobs, broken promises, and impossibly hard choices that no one was ready to bear. For people outside the palace gates, King Charles was simply a sick monarch, but for people inside the heavy walls, he was a husband, a father, a grandfather, and the single fragile thread keeping many broken relationships together. Catherine's sudden sadness showed what official papers could never explain, revealing that she was not just upset about a government crisis, but was helplessly watching a man she liked disappear behind sterile doctor orders, locked doors, and careful talks. The palace news seemed sudden, but the real truth had started days before, during a private family lunch at Windsor. There were no cameras, No outsiders, no warning, just a quiet room, a silver teapot, and one terrifying moment that shattered everything. Charles was talking confidently about returning to his royal duties. Then his voice faltered. His hand went entirely limp. A porcelain cup slipped from his fingers. It shattered against the hardwood floor, and Catherine was the absolute first to realize that something was catastrophically wrong. Charles had been hiding a crushing burden, extreme exhaustion, fading focus, sudden waves of weakness. Yet he insisted his schedule remain untouched. Why? Because royal jobs meant public ceremony, governance, and national stability. Admitting defeat meant admitting his illness had won. Catherine and William had believed his optimistic facade because he spoke so freely of future family ceremonies and long-term plans. That false hope blinded them. It masked the severe reality he fought so desperately to conceal. Then the lunch changed everything forever. Charles reached for his teacup, but his fingers refused to obey. The cup crashed down. Catherine moved instantly. She caught his arm as he tried to stand. She called for immediate medical assistance while the king flared with sudden, defensive anger. "No one should cause panic," he rasped. William rushed across the room. He ordered his father to sit, but beneath the king's anger lived raw, naked fear. And that hidden terror frightened the prince far more than the physical collapse. Camilla stepped forward with a chilling demand. This must remain an absolute secret until doctors complete their evaluation. If the public learns of this without proper control, widespread panic will follow. But keeping the truth locked away had already pushed Charles to the brink of disaster. The argument escalated into a fierce confrontation when the Queen accused William of weaponizing a single medical stumble to seize his father's constitutional power. William stared at her in disbelief. This was never about ambition. This was about whether his father could survive another collapse without immediate intervention. Camilla fell silent, her expression cold and unyielding. Moments later, emergency physicians delivered the verdict everyone dreaded. A confidential medical report confirmed the disease had accelerated far beyond previous projections. A personal physician revealed that Charles had suffered identical warning signs days earlier, choosing silence over safety. Catherine stood alone by the shattered porcelain after the medical team wheeled the king away. She knelt to clear the debris. William gently took the broken shards from her trembling hands. Neither spoke a single word. They both knew that teacup hitting the floor was the precise boundary they could never uncross. The fragments vanished in minutes, but the anger, suspicion, and haunting questions remained locked inside Catherine's mind as she prepared to walk back toward the king's private chambers.
The king is in a much worse health and much worse shape than he appears to be. All of this has had a devastating effect upon his health.
What happened behind those locked doors next would alter the monarchy's survival, and if you miss the terrifying revelation of the secret red box files waiting in the next chapter, you will never truly understand how close the crown came to complete collapse. Catherine had always maintained total respect for the sovereign, but tonight, respect could no longer mean silence. With no attendants nearby, and the heavy hallway locked tight, she walked straight into Charles's private room and turned the brass handle behind her. He expected comfort. He expected soothing words. Instead, she delivered the question no one else dared to utter. Why did he hide the earlier warning? The king looked away. This was no longer a formal audience between towering royals. It was a raw collision between two terrified human beings. Catherine told him the hard truth. Keeping secrets had never protected the nation. It had left William completely exposed, Camilla deeply suspicious, and the entire family fractured at the worst possible moment. The crown represented public power and grand duties. But she reminded him that no institution could survive if its foundation was built on concealed decay. Charles offered his defense through weary, genuine fatigue. He confessed his deepest terror. Once the world knew his condition was irreversible, the machinery of succession would ignite immediately. Every conversation would transform into a countdown. Every family visit would feel like someone measuring the time he had left. Catherine's sorrow turned sharply into fierce protection. William deserved the right to remain a son before the palace forced him to act entirely like a king. Charles heard the deeper meaning in her plea. He had spent years hardening the prince for duty, yet his silence had only loaded an unbearable weight onto his son's shoulders. Then the king revealed the secret that haunted him most. In a private recording, meant solely for his inner circle, he had confessed his true nightmare. He did not fear mortality itself. He feared his family tearing apart the moment he was gone. Catherine refused to let him retreat behind royal protocol. When his hand reached toward the heavy call bell, she placed her palm directly over his. She stated she would walk out only if he swore to stop protecting them through dangerous silence. He stared at her hand. Slowly, his fingers drifted away. He gave his word, and the atmosphere in the room shifted forever. Charles then revealed his advisor's strict demands. Major governmental responsibilities were shifting to William instantly. Official approvals, state communications, and critical policy choices would now belong to the prince. Furthermore, the king named Catherine as the vital emotional anchor connecting William, Camilla, Princess Anne, and the younger royals. Outside the heavy oak panels, Camilla had heard enough. The queen listened as Catherine declared William could not bear the burden alone. Those words landed like a declaration of war. Decisions were moving forward. Roles were altering beyond recognition, and she had not been consulted once. Catherine stepped out into the corridor, carrying the truth she fought to uncover. But waiting in the shadows was a queen ready to turn private heartbreak into an all-out battle for survival. And if you miss the explosive confrontation in the next chapter, where family loyalty shatters under the weight of the red box directives, you will never see how deep the palace betrayal truly went. After all the closed doors, secret meetings, and official choices, William and Catherine finally got to be alone in the quiet quarters of the private wing. No helpers stood near the threshold. No medical terminology cushioned the weight of the truth. No royal titles could shield them from the cold reality pressing against their shoulders. Upstairs, their children were sleeping, entirely unaware that the world outside their door was rapidly shifting beneath their feet. Down the corridor, King Charles was being monitored continuously by medical teams, and the future had suddenly arrived much faster than anyone was prepared to handle. In that silent room, Catherine confessed that her tears were not merely for the king, but for the haunting fear of losing the husband she knew to the overwhelming demands of the crown. William sat beside her in complete silence, letting the painful weight of her words settle between them. They had just finished telling Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis that their grandfather was gravely ill. For the nation, succession was a grand constitutional procedure, but for those three young children, it meant something far simpler and infinitely sadder. It meant their father might soon belong to public duty, far more than he belonged to home. George had looked up at William with quiet eyes and asked if this meant his father would now have less time to spend with them. William had paused before answering, trying to craft a promise he could actually keep, but that brief silence spoke louder than any comfort he could offer. Catherine reminded him that institutional duty had always approached slowly in the past, giving them time to adapt and prepare. This time, however, it felt as though the weight of the monarchy had broken through their front door without warning or permission. She confessed her fear that the relentless pressure of the throne would turn his focus inward, harden his tone, and force him to hide the warmth that made him a devoted husband and father. William finally admitted to a deep, lingering sense of guilt that had been quietly eating away at him. He had spent years training to assume the ultimate responsibility of the state, yet now, thinking about that future while his father was still fighting for his life, felt like a betrayal. He wanted to be ready for the nation, but being ready felt disrespectfully close to anticipating the end. Are you beginning to see how the unbearable weight of the crown destroys the quiet sanctuary of a family, and how quickly a father's duty to his country can shatter the fragile peace of his own home? Stay focused right here, because what the king sent next into this silent room changed their course forever. A private messenger arrived carrying an audio record left specifically for William and Catherine by the king. Charles spoke to them directly, stripped of formal protocol or majestic airs, asking them to ensure that their new responsibilities never destroyed the warmth and partnership that made him trust them so deeply. Hearing his father's voice through the speaker transformed the king back into a man, a father attempting to protect his children from the very burden he had carried his whole life. William realized in that instant that he could not succumb to the traditional royal instinct of enduring grief in isolated silence. He removed his jacket, sat on the floor beside Catherine, and brought his forehead against hers. She told him she could not promise never to be afraid of what lay ahead. He looked back at her and replied that she only needed to promise never to navigate that fear alone. Catherine reached out, took his hand firmly, and gave him her word. Together, on the floor of that private room, they made a solemn pact that every single government task, every public trial, and every institutional crisis would be met as equal partners. They swore to protect their children from the suffocating terror of the spotlight, refusing to let lies or false comfort shape the narrative of their young lives. William then asked her to stand directly beside him at the upcoming national appearance, not as a silent figurehead, but as his equal partner in leading the family forward. While their private compact restored a fragile peace within their personal quarters, the world outside the palace grounds was already reaching a fever pitch. By sunrise, news of the king's worsening condition and the sudden shifting of royal responsibilities had spread far beyond the stone walls. Crowds began gathering along the iron gates of Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle. Headlines across the country broadcasted the sudden pause in the sovereign's public engagements, but one striking image captured the emotional reality better than any news anchor could. A young girl walked up to the heavy gates and placed a simple, handwritten card among the growing sea of flowers. The message read, "Thank you, King Charles. Please keep fighting." Broadcast networks halted regular programming to focus entirely on the dramatic shift within the monarchy, analyzing William's expanded role and Catherine's visible grief. Public commentators debated whether the palace could maintain its stability under such sudden strain, while royal flags fluttered overhead like a heavy reminder of the authority at stake. Every discussion returned to the exact same underlying fear that gripped the nation. People were watching a deeply private family tragedy transform into a massive national transition in real time. To steady the mounting anxiety, palace officials released a secondary statement clarifying that the king remained fully aware, resting, and surrounded by his immediate family. Do you realize how thin the boundary really is between a public institution and human heartbreak, and how a single handwritten note at a palace gate can reveal the raw truth that official statements try so hard to hide? Keep watching, because what happened when Catherine stepped out in front of those cameras changed public perception in a single second. Catherine stepped into the public eye alongside William during a brief, unannounced appearance outside the estate. Exhaustion was visible in her eyes, yet her posture remained steady as she paused to acknowledge the citizens lined up along the path. She offered brief, careful words of gratitude to those offering support, but the emotional strain was nearly impossible to conceal. The public was not merely assessing the health of the reigning monarch. They were scrutinizing Catherine and William, searching for any sign of hesitation or weakness as the couple prepared to carry the future of the institution on their shoulders. William maintained a disciplined facade until a voice from the gathering called out, assuring him that the entire country was standing behind his father. The prince stopped dead in his tracks. He lowered his head, swallowed hard, and gripped Catherine's hand with sudden intensity. She squeezed his fingers instantly, anchored to the promise they had forged in their private room just hours earlier. That brief, unscripted gesture spoke volumes to the observers gathered at the perimeter. It proved that behind the regal appearances and royal duties, they were two people leaning on each other to survive an unbearable storm. Front pages across the country featured the image of Catherine's emotional moment, running under the stark headline, "A Daughter's Tears for the King." The photograph captured what formal press releases repeatedly tried to sanitize. It revealed the heavy human toll exacted by the crown. Inside his private suite, King Charles watched the news broadcasts on a small monitor. He requested his aide to replay the specific footage showing William and Catherine stepping forward together. He watched his son pause, saw Catherine hold his hand, and recognized that they were already carrying the immense weight as a united front. Seeing their unity prompted the king to make one final, decisive choice. He instructed his private secretary to summon William, Catherine, Camilla, and Princess Anne to his bedside for an immediate, private council. The nation had delivered its message of concern and loyalty, and the sovereign intended to answer it by bringing his divided household into absolute alignment. He understood that while he could not reverse his physical condition, he retained the authority to determine how his family navigated the road ahead. Have you ever wondered what actually happens when the majestic illusions of royalty are completely stripped away, leaving an elite family to confront their deepest fears in a single locked room? Pay close attention right now, because the king's final directive reshaped the entire future of the monarchy. When the four key figures entered the room, Charles spoke without the grand cadence of state speeches or the artificial comfort of scripted remarks. He acknowledged openly that his health had permanently altered the trajectory of the kingdom, and that everyone in the room was carrying immense fear. Then he offered them something far more vital than vague reassurances. He granted them full permission to step into their new roles without guilt, without suspicion, and without feeling that taking up the duty was an act of disloyalty to his reign. He confirmed his complete withdrawal from public engagements, allocating his remaining energy toward treatment and time with those he loved. Stepping away from a lifetime of public service was deeply painful, but he stated clearly that pretending he could continue as before would only create further instability. William would officially assume the primary constitutional responsibilities, taking charge of government briefings and state representation. Princess Anne would oversee key ceremonial duties, ensuring the continuity of traditional state operations. Camilla would remain at his side as his primary companion, while Catherine was tasked with maintaining the emotional cohesion of the family. The king turned his gaze directly toward Catherine. He told her firmly that her tears had not demonstrated weakness or fragility. Instead, her genuine emotion represented the essential human heart that the crown was always in danger of losing. He asked her to remember that empathy and personal care would be just as critical to the survival of the monarchy as power and authority in the difficult days ahead. Catherine bowed her head in respect, accepting the trust he had placed directly in her hands. Charles then addressed William, offering a sincere apology for hiding his initial medical symptoms. He admitted that his silence had forced his son to confront the future without the benefit of honest communication. William met his father's eyes, admitting that his own frustration had stemmed from a place of deep fear, the terrifying prospect of losing his father before they could heal the distance between them. Charles reached out and took his son's hand, reassuring him that Catherine's expanded role would never diminish Camilla's standing as queen consort. Catherine walked across the room, stopped beside Camilla, and extended her hand. The queen consort looked up, accepted the gesture, and for the first time since the crisis began, the two women stood side by side in mutual understanding. Princess Anne watched the moment in silence, recognizing that the family had finally chosen collective strength over internal division. In his final recorded statement to the household, Charles observed that an institution endures not by hiding its pain, but by transforming that pain into unity, truth, and shared purpose. As William prepared to leave the room, Charles called him back, and father and son embraced in quiet solidarity. What began as a devastating breakdown had ultimately forced the royal family to confront its reality, adapt to the inevitable, and stand together as an unbroken line against an uncertain future. By sunrise, The tragic reality could no longer be kept behind the high stone walls of Windsor Castle. The news had spilled into every breakfast room, train platform, and live news desk across the entire nation. Broadcast networks halted their scheduled shows. News anchors spoke in hushed tones. The weight of the monarchy hung heavy over the quiet streets. Yet one silent moment captured the nation's heartbreak far better than any official statement from palace officials. Outside the iron gates of Buckingham Palace, a young girl quietly stepped forward through a silent crowd and placed a small handwritten card on the pavement. It read simply, "Thank you, King Charles. Please keep fighting." Around her, hundreds of people stood in absolute silence, leaving flowers, cards, and quiet prayers for a family facing its darkest hour. Palace officials released a second emergency statement to calm the rising panic. They insisted the king was still awake, fully aware, and surrounded by his closest family. But those carefully chosen words could not disguise the massive shift occurring behind the curtain. Charles was officially stepping back from all public duties. William was taking over the government work that his father had managed for decades. The nation was watching a quiet handoff of power unfold in real time. Front pages across the country ran a single striking image under a devastating headline: "A daughter's tears for the king." Catherine's breakdown outside the private wing had become the public symbol of a family's grief. Hi viewers, how long could you stand by and watch a family's deepest agony play out on front pages across the globe before asking yourself who truly pays the ultimate price for the crown? Stay tuned right here, because what King Charles did next behind closed doors sent shockwaves through every corridor of the palace. When Catherine stepped out beside William during a short public appearance at Windsor, her eyes looked weary from tears, yet her posture remained unyielding. She spoke briefly to the crowd, thanking them for supporting Charles and standing by the family through this ordeal. Her voice faltered for a second, but she held her ground. People were not just watching a sick king, they were looking directly at William and Catherine, searching for the strength that would guide the nation tomorrow. William held his composure until a man in the crowd shouted that the entire country was praying for his father. The prince stopped dead in his tracks. He bowed his head, fighting back his own tears, and squeezed Catherine's hand as hard as he could. She squeezed back, reminding him of the solemn promise they had made on the floor of their private room just hours before. Are you beginning to see how a single unscripted gesture from a future queen can undo centuries of cold royal detachment in a split second? Don't look away, because inside his private study, the king was watching this exact moment on a small television screen. Charles sat in his chair, watching his son stop in the crowd and seeing Catherine hold William's trembling hand. He realized in that moment that they were already carrying the crushing weight of the kingdom together. The king immediately called for a private council. He summoned William, Catherine, Camilla, and Princess Anne to his room for a final family gathering. When they entered, Charles spoke without formal scripts or official language. He acknowledged that his medical diagnosis had changed the path of the monarchy forever. Then he gave them a gift, far greater than royal titles. He gave them his explicit permission to move forward together without guilt, without internal rivalry, and without shame over the duties that now belonged to them. Do you truly believe that a family divided by decades of ancient rivalries and secret tensions can remain united once the full authority of the state shifts to a new generation? Keep watching, because what happened when Catherine walked across that room left everyone in total shock. Charles outlined the exact structure that would keep the nation stable. William would handle the vital government business and lead state decision-making. Princess Anne would manage the high-level ceremonial duties to maintain historical tradition. Camilla would remain at the king's side as his devoted personal companion, while Catherine was tasked with protecting the emotional warmth of the family. The king looked straight into Catherine's eyes and told her that her tears had not shown weakness. They showed the human heart that the crown must never lose. Charles then turned to William and apologized for hiding his earlier symptoms, admitting that keeping secrets had forced his son to face the future in isolation. William took his father's hand, admitting his own anger had come from a place of terrifying fear. Catherine then stepped across the room, took Camilla's hand, and held it tightly. For the first time since the crisis began, both women stood beside Charles in complete unity, choosing trust over suspicion. In a recorded statement left for his family, Charles declared that the monarchy endures not by hiding its pain, but by turning that pain into truth, work, and unbreakable loyalty. Father and son embraced one last time before the heavy doors closed. The crisis had altered them forever, but it had not broken their resolve. Yet as peace returned to Windsor, palace insiders have just leaked a disturbing new secret. A locked drawer in the king's private desk contains a confidential directive stamped with a red seal, marked strictly to be opened only on the day of Prince William's accession. What forbidden instructions are hidden inside that envelope? And why is Camilla desperate to keep it sealed forever? You cannot afford to miss our next video, where we expose the shocking contents of the king's final secret bequest. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.